and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Audrey Lichter, and I am the Executive Director of Chai Mitzvah, the Resource Center for Jewish Engagement. Chai Mitzvah, the sponsor of Scholar Circle, is a Jewish engagement program that partners with over 700 organizations and has worked with over 9,000 individuals in small group learning, social action, and spiritual ritual development. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues which the Jewish community is facing. To that end, each lecture has a resource sheet that will be sent to you after the lecture. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. Our scholar this afternoon is Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shiradsky, a historian, editor, co-founder of the Tel Aviv Review of Books, and visiting fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. She received her PhD in modern European history from New York University, focusing on intergroup and interfaith relations, as well as nationalism, colonialism, and international politics in the modern world. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, please use the Q&A button on your screen. A Q&A will be held at about 40 minutes into the lecture, but you can submit questions anytime throughout. The lecture recording will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available on our website, chaimitzvah.org. And now to Dr. Olga Kirschbaum-Shiradsky.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about what I'm calling the do's and don'ts of talking about the war and the conflict in general. As many of you know and understand, right now, Israelis and Jews are facing the difficult situation that while there was support for Israel after October 7th, that this support has been steadily declining, including among people who support the existence of the State of Israel, with the advance of the war, particularly because of the number of civilian casualties. Even if we don't accept Hamas's numbers, and even if they're questionable, there's still a significant number of civilian casualties. And so there are people, even people of goodwill, who are not necessarily against the State of Israel, who would like an immediate ceasefire without really putting any kind of political conditions on it. But more to the point, there are other people who are concerned and who are beginning to believe the view that somehow the State of Israel is cruel or in its relation to the Palestinians or in the conflict in general. So this is with the cross-section of people who are not, in theory, against Israel being a state or the Jewish people having a homeland. Added to that, we have the difficulty that more and more younger people have been persuaded by people on the left or by Palestinian nationalists or by Islamists or by various groupings that Israel isn't really a legitimate state in the first place. So these people are all the more against the current war and put this war in really Manichaean terms, that Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians, and using terms to really delegitimize the State of Israel and the IDF as a kind of equivalent to the Nazis, right? So this is the situation, shall we call it? This is the communication situation that we are facing and I'm going to focus particularly on these do's and don'ts on what I'm going to call broadly the West, that is the United States, the English-speaking world, and parts of Western Europe. The messaging for other parts of the world is different. There are different issues involved, and so the do's and don'ts there are different. But the do's and don'ts here in the West, the United States, the Anglosphere, Western Europe, are related to our objective. What is the objective of the Jewish people, and what's the objective of the State of Israel, is to maintain our strategic alliances and maintain our standing in the world, right? Israel does not want to become a pariah state. Israel does not want to lose its economic or military or political alliances. And therefore, it's important to present. I mean, Israel must do what it needs to do, as any state does, but it's important to present and defend its perspective for these very practical and pragmatic reasons, in addition to what are, I believe the truth reasons, the ideological reasons, that we cannot allow people who delegitimize the state of Israel or who say lies about the war, even without saying lies about the war, manipulate the information about the war in such a way that it makes Israel look like a criminal state or a horrible state. So that's really our situation. So what are the challenges? What are the challenges and the difficulties? How can Israel and the Jewish people communicate a message about the war and about the state of Israel in a way that's effective, that maintains or in some cases rebuilds bipartisan support for the state of Israel and for the state of Israel's necessary military actions? That's really the question that we have to ask. And so in order to ask that, what are the challenges to that, right? And so that's what I'm going to discuss first, are the challenges to this, and then I'm going to go into what are the responses. I first want to say that these are my perspectives, and they're the Israeli government, the IDF, many spokespeople, various Jewish organizations, the Jewish people, many individuals on TikTok. There's been an amazing effort by the Jewish people and our allies. We have, as much as we have enemies, we also have allies among different peoples around the world, in the West, sometimes people from the West, sometimes people from the Middle East who live in the diaspora in the West. I'm thinking, for example, of Iranians, Iranian exiles, or Kurds, and I'll get into that. Our allies have also been presenting as groups or individually, being spokespeople, and they've been doing an amazing job. And so in this presentation, I'm just going to talk in terms of my experience of all the different efforts to present the position of the state of Israel and present an understanding of the war, which ones, in my view, are successful and which ones get people into trouble. Okay, so the first thing, if we could move to image 1, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges. The first challenge that the state of Israel faces, and people who support the state of Israel, is that there has been a barrage of images like this, and you can take this down. Images of children who are affected by the bombardments, by the Israeli bombardments, and this has been sort of a nonstop. It's really been various news agencies and various groups who are in the camp of not accepting the legitimacy of the state of Israel have really been focusing on these images, and then using them for the argument that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. Okay, and if we could move to image 2. Now, the first image was of a child in Gaza, and the second image that we're going to get is also disturbing. Unfortunately, you'll be a bit disturbed by it, but it's an image. These are unfortunately children that have passed away in the Syrian civil war. So the reason, you can take it down now. The reason that I am placing those two images beside each other is that and these are children who the images of children dying in the civil war include actions by allies against ISIS, which caused the death of a lot of Iraqi and Syrian civilians in Raqqa and Mosul, and we'll get to that, two urban places where ISIS had a war against the Allied forces. We did not get the same amount of images, which is that there's a real propaganda effort on the part of the enemies of Israel to bombard people in the West with these images of these children. And so the first point that we have to understand is that the Jewish community and the state of Israel, okay, will never, ever win, if I'm going to call it the communications war, because there's the military war and there's a communications war. We'll never win the communications war on the point of suffering. This is a very, very important point. The Jewish people in the diaspora and in the state of Israel have a long history of being stateless and being subjected to the armies and to violence by other people without having any power to fight back, or having limited power to fight back. Like, we have some resistance movements of the Jewish people in the Second World War, but not that much. So much of the education around anti-Semitism in the diaspora, and much of the education has been about the injustice of Jewish suffering. Okay, and this is very good education, and it's a very important message. The problem is the focus on Jewish suffering in this particular context, where Israel, or the Jewish people, now have a state and now have an army, and have an army that can, in a war, including a war fought according to the laws of war, which I believe the state of Israel is doing, can inflict suffering. And so we find ourselves in a situation where objectively, right, and we'll get into the causes, but objectively, the Palestinians are suffering more than the Israelis. And so if you have an audience of Westerners who aren't very knowledgeable about the situation, not very knowledgeable about the war itself, and not very knowledgeable about the history, then it becomes a numbers game. And they get very easily sucked into the numbers of civilian dead on the Palestinian side. And then they get sucked to, and this is where we have a major don't, is that when these numbers are compared to the number of Israeli civilians, right, who have died or who have been displaced, right? There are 200,000 displaced Israelis compared to 1.5 million displaced Palestinians. There have been more than 3,000 murdered Israelis compared to, now they say, 30,000, of which maybe half or a third are Hamas soldiers. So we cannot win the numbers game. And so any explaining of the war, and when I mean explaining, any conversation you have with people, cannot start from the point of Jewish suffering or Israeli suffering, because it will inevitably lead to the greater Palestinian suffering, and then it won't be, and then it will sort of go, well, if you only had 4,000 dead and you had this small invasion, why are you now destroying all of Gaza? That's how the conversations go on this. So the switch has to happen to move to, this is the single most important point, that talking about the war and talking about the state of Israel should be discussed in terms of the justice of our cause as a state, as a successful national self-determination movement, and the justice of this war, not our suffering. So while I think that is, and this has been my experience now over the many months, speaking with many people in the West, that this is this single most important thing to avoid, and very, very important to focus then on the justice of the cause. Now, as we relate, once we get into the justice of the cause, then one has to explain. This is not, by the way, to say that one shouldn't discuss the fact that there are still captives and that these captives are children, but one ought to, in my view, discuss them, and this is the due, as war crimes, right? That Hamas, so the starting point for the communication is there was a ceasefire, Hamas broke the ceasefire, Hamas invaded an act of war, killed and then committed war crimes in their act of war, including killing civilians while in the Gaza envelope, in addition to taking hostages, both of which are war crimes. And the third war crime that they committed is that they continued to shoot rockets at civilian populations. And that and then responding that the justness of the Israeli cause is that when a group commits an act of war like that, then according to the laws of war, the group attacked or the country attacked has the right not only to defend itself, right, at its borders, right? They have the right not only to push back Hamas, but they have the right to defeat Hamas, meaning the laws of war are not limited to defending, your territory. You can defeat an enemy in the laws of war. This is a very, very important point to make, and that this is the basis of all the just wars that we've had, in the 20th century. That the Allies were not limited to pushing the Nazis back to German territory. They were able, and the laws of war allowed them to defeat the Nazis. This is an extremely important point in relation to the war itself. That these are the laws, and then afterwards, and this is where we get to the comparative perspective, is to explain that unlike Hamas, which deliberately targeted civilians and deliberately committed the war crimes of taking hostages, the Israeli attacks, right, are a deliberate targeting of military targets, and that the death of civilians is a byproduct. It is not an aim. So that Israel is trying to follow the laws of war in this war, and that this is a very important distinction that you can make for people. That so that it's a just war, right? It's a war that Hamas started, that Israel has responded to, and that Israel is responding to after more than a decade and a half or more of trying to maintain the conflict, and not one of the reasons of which is the humanitarian dimension of this kind of a conflict, even when fought according to the laws of war. So the justness of the cause is very important. Now, in relation to the justness of the cause, we get into another point about the do's and the don'ts, which is that one of the things that the enemies of the state of Israel, or people who don't support the war, do is they focus entirely on Israeli actions. They say almost nothing about the actions of Hamas. So I've just given you a breakdown of what Hamas has done. Hamas's war crimes, right? And Hamas is the instigator of this conflict. But in addition to that, Hamas has a strategy. Hamas has allies. Hamas has military capabilities, right? One of the most important things in the do's is to explain that, in fact, this is a war between the state of Israel and Hamas and its allies, right? So that it's very important to explain that there are two parties, and that this is a just war between two parties, and that the just side is the Israeli side, according to the laws of war, according to acceptable and international criteria. And on top of that, to explain the strategy and the objectives and the strength of Hamas. So we can go into this a little bit, but you can explain what was the objective of Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, right? And it's important to name people, to give. It's not that we have a discourse where there's talk about Netanyahu, but nobody knows who the leader of Hamas is. So what was Sinwar's objective? His objective, this operation was years in planning, right? It took a lot of intelligence capability, a huge amount of money, right? Hundreds of millions went into the building of this tunnel network, went into all the intelligence, all the weapons manufacturing, etc. So Hamas had created an army and had created an underground bunker system to protect its army from the Israeli airstrikes. And the objective was to invade, to get a counter response that would then awaken the axis of resistance. So this, just explaining, when sticking again just to the war itself, what Sinwar and Hamas were doing is they were trying to, in fact, get an entire regional conflict aimed at Israel from all sides. Hezbollah from Lebanon, the Iranians involved in Shiite militia groups in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, to have a multi-front attack on the state of Israel. And that the Lebanese front, Hezbollah in particular, has a huge capacity of missiles that could create serious damage to Israel. That they could hit targets well into central Israel, major military targets, major civilian targets, and in addition to buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So that, God forbid, one could look at massive losses of life in Israel. So this is the objective of Hamas. So when you discuss it, you bring your interlocutor into the fact, what was Hamas trying to do? Who is Hamas? Who are their allies? How come they have this much money? How come they built 500 kilometers worth of tunnels? It's extremely important to not be on the defensive, that's a major don't, and not to focus just on what Israel is doing, but rather to bring in Hamas and its allies. And then, very important that Hamas has major state funders. It's funded by Iran to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. It's funded by Turkey in amounts that we don't know. It's funded by Qatar. So that Hamas is not working alone, and that these states, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a major regional player with an army, an army and reserve army that is larger than Israel's, with increasing military capability, and which might soon, we hope not, but which might soon be a nuclear power. So suddenly the dimension of the conflict is different, because the other way that people have criminalized this war is by reducing it to Israel and Hamas. Now, I want to get to the fact that though this was Sinwar's objective on October 7th, it didn't for the moment materialize, which is that Hezbollah did not for the moment enter the war. It has shot rockets, but in a way that is ambiguous. It's not enough to necessitate a full-on response in the way that October 7th did in the Southern Front, but at the same time enough to show its constituency that it's active. So then what was Sinwar's next step? What is his next objective? If he hasn't sort of ignited the axis of resistance against Israel. So Sinwar and the Hamas leadership, it seems that their objective now is to survive politically, right? And also to criminalize the state of Israel, because they understand that for the moment, Israel I'm still speaking just militarily, is dependent to a large degree on American weapons, ammunition, various other help. And that if Israel loses the military and political support of the West, that it's in trouble. And so what they have done, and this, by the way, is an old technique. The Sinwar has not invented it. It's not a technique just of jihadis, although jihadis have adopted it because it also fits in their view of martyrdom. But it's a technique that's been used by counterinsurgencies and also was used in the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese understood that the Achilles heel of the American government was the home front, that there was tremendous opposition to the war in the United States, and therefore they embedded themselves in civilian populations, knowing that this would create civilian deaths, and then would invite the journalists. And the idea there now, the North Vietnamese, as good communists, were ideologues, and they believed, as do many jihadis like Hamas or the Muslim Brotherhood, that there are causes that are worth dying for, that there are things that are worse. There are things that are worse than death, like losing or like not achieving one's goal, or that death is something. So it's not that Palestinians don't care about their children. Of course they do. They love their children, like all people. But there are people who also have these ideological convictions, and so this is what we've seen, the phase that the objective of Hamas now, and this is true of their entire military preparation. Not a single, if you visit Israel today, everyone knows where the mamad is, or the mechav mugan. These are or miklat, all the different words for the bomb shelter in every building, right? They haven't built any in Gaza, right? Because the tunnel network is for the soldiers. And they know that the bombing and the civilians' death work in favor of Hamas and Hamas's survival, right? Which is now the objective. The objective is for Hamas to survive politically and also to a certain degree militarily. So these are things that you can explain to people, but you explain first and foremost always, if we recap, not by focusing on the suffering. You can even admit there's no doubt that there are more Palestinians that are suffering, but that's not at stake. You move to the justice of the war, right? And then the second point is to say, look, there are two sides here. What are their objectives? What are their strategies? What do they want? Right, and that brings people into the conversation of understanding that Hamas has committed war crimes on various levels and continues to commit war crimes, not only against Israelis, but against its own people for its own political and military objectives. Now, another element, of course, then is discussing the wealth and the power. And this is very important. The more that people reduce it to an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as I've said, the more it looks like Israelis are these big bullies and Palestinians are these big victims. So it's very important when talking about Hamas to talk about all of Hamas's regional allies. Which brings me, I'd like to talk now a little bit about our regional allies, and we can bring up some pictures. If you could put picture 5, please. So while, if any of you have seen The Economist had a picture recently of, now this is the city of Raqqa, which is in Syria, and which was bombed tremendously in the fight against ISIS. Now, if any of you have seen The Economist, I was about to say The Economist cover, where it says Israel standing alone and it has this Israeli flag, this is not correct. This is not true. We have in the region many allies, the largest of which, and if you could put picture 11, are the Kurds. Now, why do I mention the Kurds, and why did I show you the picture of Raqqa? Because the Kurds don't have a state, and the Kurds have been in a military conflict with Islamists. Most recently, if you can see, this is one of the many demonstrations of Kurdish and Israeli solidarity all over Europe in particular, where there's a large Kurdish diaspora. So the Kurds were fighting the Islamic State not so long ago, right, in 2015, 2016. So they have a common Islamist enemy, and the Islamic State is Islamist, just like Hamas is Islamist. And they also have had a common enemy with extreme Arab nationalists who don't accept that Kurds should have a homeland, don't accept that they should be sovereign, unlike in the case of Israel, since the Kurds have not established a state, they've been subjected to forced assimilation, whether it's Arabization or in Iran. There are Kurds in Iran, they've been forced assimilation there, as well as violence, political violence, etc. So the Kurds see the situation with Hamas as similar to the situation that they are living. So this brings us to the second part. The first part is really a discussion of the war and the main points about the war. The second part is the issue of the legitimacy of the state of Israel, which is very linked to it and which is coming very much under attack. Many people don't know about the Kurds. This seems very eccentric to them. Why would you bring up the Kurds in a discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? But that's because most people don't understand basic points about the history of the region. Yet, because they don't, it's an opportunity, I think, to explain this. And so the first way that you can say it in a simple manner, and this goes back to the do's and don'ts, is don't call it the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do call it Israel's regional conflict with its enemies, right? Israel has never been at a war just with Palestinians, ever. All of the wars, 48, 67, 73, 82, and even today are now wars between Israel, Palestinians, and Palestinians' allies, right? Because this is a region where Palestinians have significant allies, whether they're Arab nationalist allies or whether they're Islamist allies. And so it's, and the same way, and this is what's much less, so that you can say, and many people know that, and people understand about Iran supporting, but you can add that information. But in addition to that, you can explain that there are actually peoples in the region who have a similar experience to Israel and who are allies on Israel's side. And that is much less known. I just want to open a little parenthesis to explain why it is less known. It's less known because Israel has been very weary about openly talking about its allies, because many of them are endangered by an alliance with us. And also because Israel has to be careful in not provoking the ire of the enemies of these small groups. But to get to the history, what's very important to understand is anyone who comes to you saying Israel is a settler colonial state and now it's committing a genocide, you just say, very simply, you say, um, I understand that that settler colonialism is bad, but there is simply no comparison between the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians and the entire Middle East and North America or Australia or New Zealand. They're just completely different historical realities. The Middle East is an area with many historic peoples that have lived with multiple imperial conquests. And at the end of World War I, all of these peoples had been under Turkish imperial rule for hundreds of years. The Arabs and the Jews there, and the other smaller nationalities you might not have heard of, the Kurds, the Assyrians, the Maronite Christians, the Druze, and all of these smaller groups were offered national self-determination in various forms by the Allied powers. Just like in Europe, some of these smaller groups had been under imperial rule for hundreds of years. The Slavic peoples of Central Europe, like the Czechs and the Slovaks, hadn't had their own country for hundreds of years, since the Middle Ages, really. So there's lots of groups, all of whom have claims. This has nothing to do with the situation in Canada or the United States, where you have Native peoples who are conquered by a group who have their own homeland. So you set this story straight. There's no comparison. And then you enter into the fact that the Jewish people have a historical connection to the land. It's documented beautifully by archaeology, by Jewish history, by sources outside of Jewish history, by other peoples. And they're one of many peoples in the region who want to have national self-determination. Right. And then you can say, well, why haven't you heard of these other peoples? Because many of them were betrayed by the British and the French. The Kurds, who today number 40 million, were betrayed in their offer for self-determination. They were offered, like with the Jews, to fight against the Ottoman Empire and in return to have a state. The Assyrians were offered a state. The Maronite Christians were offered a state, and they received one, but in a combination that led to a civil war, just like the Jews received one, but in a combination that has led to a permanent conflict with the Palestinians. So you simply dispel, the don't is to call it an Israeli Palestinian conflict. The don't is to accept that any kind of comparison and to simply say this is a completely different region. And then if you can go into it, say that these very peoples who did not receive national self-determination in World War I, surprise, surprise, are our allies today, and particularly the Kurdish people are allies today because they face the same challenges, right? The challenges of Arab nationalism, which seeks Arab power in the region, or Iranian nationalism, which seeks Iranian power in the region and won't allow the national self-determination of other groups, as well as Islamism. So if we can, I want to show you here, and the West is, for the most part, sympathetic to the Kurds. If you could show image 8, this is this is a sort of very sympathetic depiction of Kurdish fighters, including there were a lot of women Kurdish fighters fighting against ISIS. And these resemble much more the sympathetic pictures that Jewish sources or Israeli sources show of the IDF fighting against Hamas. So I think that at this point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to open up for questions, and we can elaborate more on these do's and don'ts and the challenges that many of you, I'm sure, are facing.
Okay. Thank you, Olga, for such an illuminating and clear description of what's happening and such important points. So we have a few questions. One question is a more general question. Why do you think Israel is losing the PR war?
So as I explained before, the suffering and the bombardment of pictures of the Gazan civilians, and the sort of bombastic terms and false accusations of wanting to commit genocide are having an impact. And unlike in the case of ISIS, where the Western there's also kind of an interest and an obsession with Israel, and a focus of counter propaganda, which is that the forces of propaganda sort of supporting ISIS are not there in the kind of numbers that they exist. Al Jazeera, which is very powerful, has it has a lot of outlets, etc. So I think that's one of the main features. And then the other feature is that this idea that Israel is not a legitimate state, that it's a settler colonial state, which is, as I explained, false, right? The Middle East is not North America, it's not Australia, it's completely different. But it's nevertheless a narrative that has captured various institutions. It's very strong among academics who should know better, but who use this narrative. And so when you have an institutional capture of a narrative, then that has a very strong impact, because people who have authority have speak in these terms, and that's very very problematic. So I think that those are we have smart, and I think this goes. I respect the strategic and military intelligence of the Palestinian enemies of Israel. Not all Palestinians are enemies, but the ones who are. And I think that we need to understand that they've been very savvy and very smart in how they've shifted and how they've done that.
There is another question, and just to illuminate a little bit more, what are you talk about the rules of war, and that this is a just war, and that you have a right to not only defend yourself, but to vanquish your enemy. In this case, what does that mean, particularly when we are talking about so many civilian deaths? At what point is it an open topic, or can there be unlimited number of deaths, or are there caveats on that?
So look, military technology is such today that it's highly destructive. But the laws of proportionality have to do with not with the number of civilians dead, but the force proportional to the importance of the military target. Okay, and so for the moment, maybe we will find a time, like in the verses of Isaiah, that everyone will drop their weapons. But in the interim, those are the rules. So you have, if someone attacks and causes a war, then you can defend yourself and vanquish them, and you can attack military targets with the force proportional to the importance of those targets. And if there are civilian casualties, it's not the reason for stopping the war. Now, we have to remember that Hamas is also responsible for embedding itself in civilian infrastructure. Every time they embed themselves in civilian infrastructure, they're committing a war crime. Okay, and so of course their strategic objective, which is very clever, is to get people who have a heart and don't like seeing children dying, right? To get Israel to stop its legitimate attacks on military targets because of the civilian deaths. So it's a very cynical strategy. Now, if the problem with stopping, stopping or ceasefire, is that you effectively empower bad actors to use this strategy again and again. The same thing with the issue of negotiating for hostages. Now, everybody wants the hostages back, and everyone is prepared to do a lot for that. But everyone also understands that there's a danger in giving too much for hostages, so that you, in fact, just encourage more and more hostage taking. So when you have an enemy that uses these war crimes, it's a very difficult balance. Obviously, you don't want a situation where one can legitimately kill so many civilians according to the laws of war. On the other hand, if Israel stops without any kind of political gain, or then we have effectively given a victory to this strategy of using war crimes. So it's a very, I don't envy the generals in the IDF, and I don't envy any of the generals who are dealing with these type of fighters. What I will say, and if we can go back to, well, we don't have to go back to the image, but I brought the image of Raqqa because the IDF is actually doing much better in terms of civilian casualties than even the American and Iraqi forces or the Syrian, the coalition against ISIS did. Meaning that the most people believe that the war against ISIS was a just war, and it caused far more civilian casualties proportional to the military that were taken out than what the IDF is doing. So in military terms, the IDF is actually doing really well. Its ratio of taking out combatants to casualties is very good, but most people don't have that military knowledge. So to get back to whether it's an open question or not, right now we have a series of rules of war, and Israel is following them. And what will happen, and whether it is wise for, if the casualty numbers keep on rising, for Israel to just stop for that, I'm not sure. You know, it might save more lives in the short term. Will it save more lives in the long term? Not clear.
Okay, there are a number of other questions. One question was, you spoke about the regional partners that Hamas has. Can you speak a little bit about the influence of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so today the Soviet Union, of course, doesn't exist. Russia is an actor, but there is a memory of Cold War relationships. And so the Soviets were important in that the Soviets, though they voted for the creation of the State of Israel, for various reasons over the course of the late 1940s, Israel moved into the American sphere, and the Soviet Union backed the Arab League states that fought against Israel. Not in 48 itself. In 48 itself, Israel received weapons from Czechoslovakia, but starting particularly in the 1950s and then in the 1960s. So Israel and the Arab states were part of the Cold War, and they received the Arab states that fought against Israel received their training and their weapons from the Soviet Union. Israel received, after Czechoslovakia became part of the Soviet bloc, Israel received its weapons and its training and from France, and not from the United States. It received money from the United States, but militarily its major ally was France. And Israel's major allies in the earlier years were kind of from the anti-Nazi resistance West, and even the communist bloc, until it shifted to the communist bloc in the 50s. So that was that was for the conventional wars that Israel fought against its regional enemies in 1948, 67, and 73. When the Palestinians understood that they couldn't defeat Israel in these conventional wars, then they moved to a different set of tactics. Very clever. They modeled their fight against Israel on the Algerian War, and that's when they come up with the settler colonial model. The Algerians fought a war to defeat the French and French power. The French had conquered Algeria and were ruling it, and to expel the French. And Arafat spent a lot of time in Algiers, and he used that as the model. And it was a model where a ground force was fighting a much more powerful conventional army, and they succeeded. And they also succeeded through communication. And the Soviet Union was instrumental also in this kind of Zionism is imperialism, sort of creating this strategy of Zionist imperialism. So that was the role that the Soviet Union had, and I think it has continued. This whole strategy has continued in the United States and in the West by people who are still influenced by Marxist ideology. So the most prominent person is Angela Davis, for example, who was head of the American Communist Party, who had studied in East Germany, who had visited Moscow and had visited the Soviet Union, and who continues to call Zionism an imperialist and settler colonial project.
Okay. So first, we didn't mention, but that Olga is speaking to us from Tel Aviv. where she lives. And I wonder if you could comment on the different messages that we're getting, that you understand we're getting here in the West, as opposed to the messages that are coming locally in Israel, and the difference between them, and why you think there is a disconnect.
So there are a number of aspects. So one of them is that in the United States, other than in some conservative or right-wing media sources, and I'm thinking, for example, of Douglas Murray, who's been very vocal in support of Israel, but who interviews mainly in conservative or right-wing venues. You're getting a very I would say, homogenous message in the United States. So in the mainstream liberal or corporate media, New York Times, and the sort of online media relate to that, you're getting sort of this one message, and it's a message that Netanyahu and his extremists are prolonging this war, and they want this war. And it's a message that barely says anything about the strategy of Hamas. All of that focuses, that talks a lot about, and if the further left you go, like Democracy Now, it talks exclusively about the Israeli genocide and the rest of it. So you're not getting the regional picture particularly. And a lot of people in the American Jewish community, for historical reasons, important historical reasons, and also on other topics like the environment or social issues, are not right-wing or not interested in looking at conservative media for reasons that I think are legitimate, but so they don't get that perspective. That's the only place you're getting that perspective in the West. Now, Israelis, by the way, if you accept that perspective, it doesn't mean you accept the conservative viewpoint on other topics. It's just on this particular topic, the conservatives have a more sympathetic, or most of them, a more sympathetic understanding of Israel, and look more critically at what Hamas and its allies are doing. So that's the first thing, is the homogeneousness of it. Whereas in Israel, it's not only that you get news across the board, but most, with a very small exception of the far left, the very divided Israeli society of before October 7th is pretty much united on the necessity of the war. There's only a very, very small contingent of Israeli society that thinks that the ground invasion was wrong. And then Israelis also have family involved. Almost everyone is one degree of separation away from someone who's in reserves, who's fighting, who sees what's going on. And actually, if I could put up an image, one of the things that surprised the reserves, if you could put up image 3, is that when one of the reserves entered Gaza, after all of the messaging prior to October 7th of Gaza being this open air prison, many of the reserves who entered were just surprised at the degree of functionality of the society. It was a society that really also had luxury hotels, also had lots of beautiful buildings. It's not to say that there's no poverty in Gaza or the rest of it, but that there was a disconnect even because Israelis are not allowed inside Gaza. So so this discourse of Gaza as this horrible open air prison before. So there's also part of the Israeli public, I'm giving this as an example, that is not susceptible to the kind of propaganda that is coming from Hamas or people who are pro the Palestinians in the way that people in the West are. Right, because they've seen manipulations, they've seen images that are very different than the discourse. So then the other thing is that Israelis understand the regional picture. Most American Jews, they understand that Iran's a problem, but they don't understand the full regional picture. They don't understand the ravages that Islamism is doing all over the region. Maybe they know a little bit about the Abraham Accords if if you listen to my last talk, I gave a talk on the Abraham Accords, but maybe they know that Israel has some regional allies, don't really know the importance of it, because again, the homogeny of the message in the American liberal media, which is on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so if that's the message that you're getting, then it's if you're getting a message that it's this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israelis are a lot stronger, and they're just beating the crap out of the Palestinians, then a person who's fair-minded and who cares about humanity will be persuaded by this. But if you're getting a broader message, if you're getting the regional context, if you're getting Israel's regional supporters, right? When Kurds are being hung as we speak in Iran for being spies for Israel, right? When the Kurdish delegation came to Israel, and I was with them, the Kurdish diaspora delegation, a couple of people had to use pseudonyms, right? It's very dangerous for them. And yet they're still doing this. This is how important and how much they see Israel as part of a wider project to fight Islamism and fight these imperial or nationalist projects that don't allow these other groups to have their own sovereignty. They want a multinational, tolerant Middle East, right? There are rabbis who traveled to the United Arab Emirates during the war, right, to have conversations with ministers, right? So again, this is not for people who are ideologically committed to a different vision. You're not getting this news. So I think one of the things that I would say to the American Jewish community, also to be informed, if you don't read Hebrew, is you're not betraying your environmental convictions. You're not betraying your belief in the welfare state by looking at some conservative commentators on this topic, because that's where you'll get some English language commentary that's a bit different. And then you decide, you make your analysis from that. But getting these different perspectives is important. You can also listen to Indian media in English. The Indians also have a very different perspective on this. They have they have issues with Islamism. They have concerns with Pakistan. Pakistan is not a stable state. It's a state that's susceptible to harboring Islamists. So that's another source. So you have to look at different sources beyond the mainstream media.
There's so many questions on a whole variety of issues. A lot about what do we do about this misinformation, and how do we combat it? There is a question about the de-radicalization. Is it possible to see a Palestinian Gaza that is de-radicalized, as we witnessed in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere? And do you feel that there is a future for the Palestinian people, and how would that happen?
So I'm obviously not a prophet. I can only give you my aspirations based on things on the ground. Obviously, the players who I think Israel is working with and would like to work with for a de-radicalized de-radicalized Gaza and West Bank are the United Arab Emirates and much more quietly the Saudis. And they have the money to fund de-radicalization. They have the money to rebuild Gaza. And the question is what kind of an agreement they will want from Israel to do that, and what kind of conditions, and also whether they can succeed in the balance of power against the Iranians, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Turks. If you get a chance to watch my previous lecture on the Abraham Accords, you'll learn about that, who the regional alliances are. But in brief, it's the Israelis, the Gulf states like the Emirates, and more quietly the Saudis, and then regional, and then Kurds, Morocco, Abraham Accord partners against the Islamist Brotherhood and the Iranian Islamists. That's sort of the breakdown. And Assad is a holdover. The old secular Soviet Arab leaders have kind of lost somewhat of their place, although Egypt and Jordan are on the side of the Israelis, but very quietly and with conditions. So these are countries that outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood and are against extremism. So that's the hope. that's the hope that we can move in that direction. And I even hope that it will mean, this is a two-state solution that also aspirationally would include more religious understanding, right? Because the different there's also, it's not just the political acceptance of the state of Israel and the common enemy of the Islamists, but there's also the issue that the Emirates and the Moroccans and particularly in the Emirates and in the Gulf, that there's a greater openness to Judaism, and there isn't this obsession like in Iran and among the Brotherhood of reconquering Al-Aqsa, of Judaism having no place, and a kind of theological, that there's room theologically in these Muslim states for an Islam that accepts Judaism and accepts the Jewish people's value to the world. And that's very, very important. So I hope all of these forces are strengthened. I have to say, though, that there are forces in the West that want accommodation and détente with Iran, that are not interested in siding with the Saudis and the Israelis for several reasons. Some are economic, some of them is they don't want to be dragged into another Middle Eastern war. And they think that if they balance the power between the Saudis and the Iranians at the expense of the Israelis or at the expense of the Kurds or others, that there won't be another war. That was President Obama's policy. I understand the logic to it. I think that it is proven to have been a policy that I don't think has a future. I think that it was used cynically by the Iranians and by the Brotherhood. So it was tried and it hasn't succeeded, but that's the aspiration. I think I want to go to the question of, since we only have 3 minutes, of what people can do. So again, the takeaway is you just tell them, I think you can start by acknowledging that the Palestinians are suffering more than the Israelis. But that the issue of this war is not about who suffers more. The issue of this war is that it's a just war. When that Hamas really hoped to annihilate Israel by activating the entire axis of resistance, it didn't happen. But when you attack a country, that's the laws of war. And if we don't want those laws, if we want countries, we want groups, armed groups or countries to willy-nilly attack another country and then not to fight back, what kind of a world are we going to live in? And then the second is that's not an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These are regional players, and the problem is Islamism. The problem is Arab imperialism, not accepting other nations in the region, and their right and their historical claims. And then the other one is that you just stop people in their tracks. There is simply no comparison between the settler colonialism of Canada, the United States, and Australia, and what's happening in the Middle East. And anyone who has told you that is giving a manipulative message with a political aim. So we have 2 minutes left, so we can take one more question, I think.
There are many, many questions. Olga, is there one parting message that you'd like to leave us with? It seems that we could be hearing from you for much, much longer than we have.
I think my parting message is to be brave and not to be sucked into guilt, right? And so what I said before is you acknowledge the suffering. And I want to leave you with something that a Native American leader, and unfortunately I don't remember his name, but there was an attempt by the Native American groups in Washington to come out with a pro-Palestinian, pro-ceasefire resolution. And when the Native American leaders refused to do it, and he said, we are very, very sorry for what the leadership has done to the Palestinian people. And but we will not come out against Israel in this just war, right? And I'm paraphrasing, okay? And he also spoke about we will not come out against another Indigenous people. I'm not sure if he used the term just war, but more definitely he said we're very sorry for what the leaders are doing and that we're not coming out against another Indigenous people. And so I think it's maintaining and acknowledging the suffering and the humanity of everyone, but at the same time explaining that there are rules, there are consequences to actions, that there are two parties, and that these two parties have allies, have money, have arms, have calculations, have strategies, and to lay that out and not to be afraid to do it, and then to tell people that we have allies in this region, because Islamism is a menace, and imperialism is a menace, and that's different than Islam and national self-determination.
Hey, thank you so much for your incredibly insightful presentation today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Kirschbaum-Suransky again. Our next Scholar Circle lecture features Dr. Andrew Pessin on setting the record straight, dispelling myths surrounding Israel on Monday, April 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You will all get a copy of this incredibly insightful and important lecture, and it will also be posted on our website. Thank you all for attending, and thank you again, Dr. Kirschbaum Sharansky, for this amazing lecture. We'll see you again all on April the 8th.
Thank you for coming, and good luck, everybody.